Welcome to the second lecture on Henry VII's foreign policy. Today we are going to examine a number of treaties that Henry VII signed with foreign nations, which were used to bolster the security of Henry's position as King of England and increase the prestige of the Tudor dynasty. This lecture will be split into 4 parts. Firstly, we will discuss Henry's relationship with Brittany and France. Secondly, we will examine the relationship Henry had with the growing power of Spain. Then we will examine Henry's relationship with Scotland. Finally, we will evaluate the extent to which Henry was able to meet his key aims of security and prestige through treaties with other countries. Henry's first major foreign policy incident came with his support for Brittany during the Breton crisis. Brittany was a fiefdom of France, meaning the Dukes of Brittany owed homage to the French crown, but Brittany remained an independent region to the northwest of France. In 1487, the Duke of Brittany was nearing death. He would leave behind a young heiress, called Anne. Charles VIII of France saw this as an opportunity to annex Brittany, in other words to conquer it. To do this, he intended to marry Anne of Brittany. He arrived to propose marriage to the young heiress with 15,000 soldiers behind him. The conflict quickly escalated. Anne of Brittany was formally betrothed to Maximilian of Austria, the future Holy Roman Emperor, and as a result he sent 1,500 troops to defend Brittany's independence. In total it took 4 years, from 1487 until 1491, to be resolved. Henry VII was reluctant to become involved in any foreign conflict, but when it came to the Breton crisis, he had little choice. Brittany had harbored him as a fugitive and rival claimant to the throne from the tender age of 4. This meant he was morally obliged to defend Brittany's independence from the aggression of France. Henry had security concerns too. If Charles VIII was to annex Brittany, France would then occupy the full northern shoreline, with only the Channel Sea separating France from England. Since France was an old enemy to England, Henry did not want this security risk to occur. As a result of this obligation, Henry signed the Treaty of Redon in February 1489. He pledged to send 6,000 troops to defend Brittany's independence, and he raised a tax subsidy to afford the muster. However, in a savvy move, he got Maximilian to agree to pay for the maintenance of the army once they had arrived in Brittany. This meant that Henry was publicly defending Brittany's independence and so was seen to be an honorable king, but without taking a serious financial risk. Henry was also clever with his timing. He sent the troops late in the campaign season, when he knew that Charles VIII would not wish to engage in combat. Charles VIII had ambitions in Italy and so was quick to sue for peace. This meant Henry could withdraw from the conflict without tarnishing his international reputation. The peace treaty wasn't concluded until 1492, but Henry was able to use it to negotiate favorable terms. For example, as part of the agreement, Charles VIII had to promise to no longer harbor pretenders to the English throne, and so Perkin Warbeck was evicted from the French court. Further still, Henry gained a handsome pension from the Treaty of Etaples as part of the settlement. The French crown would pay £5,000 per annum to the English crown. This helped to bolster Henry's financial security and rely less on Parliament for tax subsidies. Let's now examine Henry VII's relationship with Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Henry recognized Spain as a rising power on the European stage. Due to the unification of Spain in 1474 and the ongoing conquest of Granada to the south, he wished to create a strong alliance with Spain since he hoped that, as Spain rose, England could catch hold of her coattails. Therefore, Henry decided to offer his eldest son Arthur in betrothment to Ferdinand and Isabella's second daughter, Catherine of Aragon. This was the main term of the Treaty of Medina del Campo of 1489. This dynastic treaty would create a formal alliance and therefore provides the Tudor dynasty with legitimacy in the eyes of international leaders. The treaty also acted as a trade agreement, and Henry was able to negotiate favorable tariffs that would benefit English merchants. It also offered mutual protection against each other's enemies and a promise not to harbor any claimants or pretenders to the throne. However, in the long term, Medina del Campo did have some disadvantages, since under the reign of Henry VIII it would lead to England's involvement in Spain's conflict with France. However, the treaty was not straightforward. It took another decade for Henry and Ferdinand to agree a sum for Catherine's dowry. In addition, Ferdinand was reluctant for the marriage to go ahead while Perkin Warbeck was still at large. However, it was finally settled in 1499 and the wedding took place 2 years later in 1501, when Arthur was 15 and Catherine was 16. The couple were married for only 5 months before Arthur died in 1502. Though brief, their marriage would prove to be one of the most controversial of the Tudor age due to the simple conundrum of whether or not it had ever been consummated. Following Arthur's death, Henry was keen for the alliance to hold, therefore he suggested to Ferdinand that Catherine should marry his second son Henry. Once again Ferdinand was reluctant to oblige, showing he clearly did not value the Anglo-Spanish alliance as much as Henry did. Furthermore, in order for Prince Henry to marry Catherine, they would have to seek a papal dispensation. This is when the Pope dispenses or gets rid of a biblical law. In this case, there was a biblical law that a man should not marry his brother's widow. Ferdinand reluctantly agreed to negotiate the papal dispensation, but at a price. However, during these proceedings, Ferdinand's wife Isabella passed away. This led to a power struggle between Ferdinand and his daughter Joanna of Castile. Henry, fed up with Ferdinand's antics, decided to side with Joanna. As a result, Catherine was left in limbo at the English court, a convenient political tool to be picked up and put down when needed. In the end, Ferdinand ensured that Catherine would not wed Prince Henry while ever his father was still alive. They wouldn't marry until he became Henry VIII in 1509, by which point, Catherine had been left a virtual prisoner of the English crown for 7 years. Let's now examine Henry's relationship with Scotland. One of the first things that Henry negotiated when he became king in 1485 was a truce with James III of Scotland. This is because the two nations were old enemies and shared a land border. This meant Henry could focus on domestic security and overcoming the initial threats from Yorkists like John de la Pole. However, the peace did not last. In 1496, James IV decided to show public support for Perkin Warbeck and launch an invasion over the Anglo-Scottish border. James IV hoped that the people of Northumberland would rally behind Warbeck as Richard IV of England, but they did not. This meant that Henry did not need to engage in warfare, though he had raised a tax subsidy in preparation of a conflict. Henry negotiated peace with Scotland in 1497 with the Truce of Eighton. As part of this, James IV had to expel Perkin Warbeck from his court. Henry sweetened the deal by offering his daughter Margaret in marriage to James IV. Margaret married James IV in 1502 at the tender age of 12. Her namesake, Margaret Beaufort, was against her granddaughter becoming a child bride. Henry overrode this decision, showing he will put foreign relations, especially those linked to security, ahead of his family's wants or needs. The wedding formed part of the Treaty of Perpetual Peace of 1502. This was an ironic title since the peace would only last for another decade. Let's now go back to Henry's key aims, which were discussed in the previous lecture. Firstly, let's examine security. Henry was successful in avoiding war and therefore remaining frugal with expenditure. This provided financial security. He was especially successful at preventing a proper Scottish invasion in the late 1490s through negotiating a marriage treaty. However, he was less successful at defending the English shores from the threat of a French invasion. This is because Henry did not put up a huge resistance against Charles VIII when he annexed Brittany. This meant that future Tudor monarchs would need to defend a larger shoreline against French naval invasions. Now let's examine how well Henry was able to bolster England's prestige through the various peace and dynastic treaties. Certainly, England was placed in higher esteem on the European stage, and all European powers recognized the legitimacy of the Tudor dynasty. The two most important treaties to this achievement were the Treaty of Etaples, with its generous French pension, and the Treaty of Medina del Campo, which allied England with the growing power of Spain. However, again, there were limitations. Once Henry VIII finally did marry Catherine, he was essentially chained to an alliance with Ferdinand. This meant Henry would break the Treaty of Etaples and support Ferdinand's conflict with Louis XII of France. As a result, the French pension stopped. Furthermore, it was clear that England was the less powerful partner in the alliance. Ferdinand withheld Catherine's dowry until he gained exactly what he wanted from the treaty. Let's return to our overarching question of how did Henry VII use treaties with foreign policies to bolster the Tudor dynasty? Firstly, Henry was unable, or potentially unwilling, to defend Brittany's independence in the late 1480s, even though he owed the duchy a debt. Instead, he focused on achieving a strong relationship with the most powerful nation of Europe, France, and this was achieved through the Treaty of Etaples in 1492. Secondly, Henry forged an alliance with Spain with the 1489 Treaty of Medina del Campo. However, it was not without its limitations. This was partly out of Henry's control, with the death of his son Arthur, but there was also a cost to forming an alliance with Spain, since Henry VIII would start his reign in the pocket of his stepfather Ferdinand. Henry was certainly successful in his relations with Scotland, acting swiftly and competently when dealing with the invasion of 1496 by securing another dynastic treaty between his daughter Margaret and James IV, known as the Treaty of Perpetual Peace. Most historians therefore consider Henry VII's foreign policy to be a success, especially when compared to the expensive failings at the start of Henry VIII's reign. Henry VII was able to achieve his two main aims. He was able to defend the borders of England from foreign invasion whilst not spending money on military pursuits, and he was able to bolster England's reputation in Europe and receive recognition as the legitimate monarch of England from all of Europe's major leaders. Thank you for listening. In the next lecture, we will examine how well Henry managed trade with other nations, including his foray into New World exploration.